Welcome to ThreatTank, a podcast covering the latest threat intelligence, threat response, and insights about the security landscape around the globe. I'm your host, Tom Gorup, Vice President of Security Services at Edgio, and joining me today are Richard Yu, Senior Director of Product Management for Edgio Security Solutions, and Michael Grimshaw, Director of Platform Engineering at Edgio. Welcome, Richard, Michael. How you guys doing?
Thanks for having me here again.
Again, this might become a recurring theme, Richard. I don't know.
Yeah, I hope
So
so.
I hope so. Yeah, exactly. It's a lot of fun. So last time I opened up with an icebreaker question, and I felt like we had to keep that going, but finding one is not easy, right? Because I think we set a solid bar last time. So here's my icebreaker, and for what it's worth, I've not given it time to think about it either, so I'll join in on this one. But here's a question. I'm going to ask you first, Michael. I'm going to put you on the spot. If you had to be trapped in a TV show for 1 month, a full month, what show would you choose and why?
I got to admit, the first thing that comes to my mind, and I wasn't even alive in the first run of this, would probably be Gilligan's Island, because the idea of spending an entire month on a tropical island, even if you've got to use the professor to figure out how to get running water or anything else like that, a nice tropical island for a month doesn't sound too bad at the moment.
What an answer. That is, I love it. No, I haven't seen Gilligan's Island, and I'm not even going to say the word out loud. It's been a long time since I've watched it. That's a good answer. What about you, Richard?
Oh wow, that's a tough one. I've been thinking about. Well, I mean, outside of Peppa Pig, like, is there any other TV show that has pig? I gotta keep the same pig teams going, but I guess I'm gonna stop with that. I guess for me, like, hands down, Game of Thrones. Like, I mean, like, I would be trapped inside Game of Thrones. Well, maybe I'll get the first day or the last day, who knows? But yeah. I mean, let's go with that.
That's brave.
Yeah, that's
That's
very brave. Yeah,
it's pretty bold, man.
I'll probably just put on my black cloaks and just stand on a wall and see what happens.
Well, Tom, let me also give you the inverse. Any Game of Thrones and any zombie-themed movie shows would be on my not to be a part of list. So
that's a good answer. You want to survive, right? That's fair. Richard, man, bold. Game of Thrones. So I was sick last week. Unfortunately, I had COVID, which was miserable, but I did catch up on some old House reruns. So I think I would choose House. I definitely want to sit in on some diagnosis and probably say it's not lupus. I just need to say it at least one time. It's not lupus. It's never lupus. And just that would be my show for a month. I think it would be a good time. At least I know my survival rate would be pretty high by comparison to Richard's choice there.
I mean, who needs House when you have ChatGPT? Who needs Doctor nowadays?
Yeah. All right. So we're not here to talk about TV shows. We're here to talk about actually a new trend report that we're coming out with, that Edgio is coming out with, which I'm super excited about. I took a snapshot of Q4 and looking at all sorts of trends. This is the first time in a very long time, in years. I'd say it's a kind of a revival of this report, and we're covering all sorts of data points from request methods, trends over time, MIME types, all sorts of geolocation, and that's what I kind of brought you both here today to talk about, because I think there's a lot of interesting insights out of looking at data this way. I think sometimes you can look at data sets, you're like, well, so what? What does it matter? Why am I even looking at this? How can we look at this information and extrapolate some value out of it? And I'm pretty excited to get both of your insights. So two kind of high level categories of topics that kind of came to mind that I'd be, again, interested in your perspectives on. One was application architecture, right? If we're looking at this report, thinking about our architecture, our applications, how we're leveraging our tools to be properly configured based on the architecture of our app, and also maybe some compliance aspects of like how can we use this information to start thinking about, again, our apps in a different way. So to start off, I think application architecture, so kind of getting our frame of reference here, there's 2 data points in this report. We look at request methods and MIME types. And there's more. We can definitely feel free to, you guys have seen reports, you have access to, you can pull whatever you have in there. But first, why is it important to look at these sorts of things like request methods and MIME types? I mean, when you first look at the report, it was like over 98% of requests were get and posts. Well, welcome to the internet, right? Like why is it important to look at that data this way? What do you guys think?
What do you want to go for? All right, go, Mike.
No, I was just what I would call out some of the big things that comes to my mind is you very much what you observe. What you observe matters. What you're looking at matters. So there we can talk architecture and building like new greenfield apps and all the architecture about that on one side. But a first thing I would get, and it's the power of reports like this and data and information like this, obviously threat intelligence. I'm a big believer in doing your architecture around your compliance, your security needs, and really the non-functional requirements is, the business logic of your application is not a small pool. But gone are the days where you can just focus on just business logic and one thing. You have to be looking at multiple dimensions, like how you can adjust your observability, how you can take more advanced infrastructure and platform approaches like repaving and rotation of credentials. We could talk for days about that. But the big thing it comes down to is having actionable intelligence to know what you're looking for. So from you mentioned tools, that's one of the first things I would call out. Understanding where you are, what the vectors are, what state actors are leveraging, what script kiddies and everyone in between is leveraging. That needs to inform you of what you're looking at, whether you're doing quarterly, scans. Hopefully you're doing scans more than just quarterly. Obviously, depending on your compliance profile, you need to do them at a minimum quarterly, but hopefully you're moving to more of a DevSecOps shift right model where you're continuously scanning or where you're continuously monitoring for security and vulnerabilities. So the first thing I would call out is this data, this information is important to know what you need to be taking a closer eye on, what you need to be tweaking your observability stack to look for, your security observability stack. And then inversely on shift right, it's paying attention to more things and more potential vulnerabilities that you can introduce in your code to make sure you don't do that. You've got to have an eye on a horizon. Me and Richard, anytime we have one of these conversations, you're going to hear a lot of analogies, but it is kind of like if you're in a marathon or you're doing cross-country running or something like that, you keep your eyes on the horizon so that after you have to tactically shift one way or another because of a pothole, a river or something like that, you're not losing sight of the horizon that you're running towards.
I mean, like the other way, like you look at this, right? It also, when it comes to application architectures, when I look at the data, like Tom said, most of the requests is going to be get and post, but it's internet, right? But I think one of the things that you break down, it's also when you look at the data, like how much requests, because it tells you stories of like what is the compositions of the content that we're getting, right? Obviously, if you are running a lot of applications space, especially like let's say you have a spa, right? Like as your primary, like architectures, right? You're gonna see a lot of posts. You're gonna see a lot of different methods, right? If you take a lot of user generated content, you might see a lot of posts and puts, right? So it's a really good breakdown to see, and also given that this is security data, it means that this data comes from our web application firewall, right? It really see like how much of the payloads that we inspect that actually trips a WAF. And so in this case, right, a lot of them are get, right, but you also see a quite significant amount of those things coming from posts because that's where the payloads come from. So it's very, and it really tells the stories about the surface areas of your attack, and it tells you that like if you just look at your request method distributions, right? Anything that receive any endpoint that has a post, right? You're gonna get a much larger surface area because like post is like I use an analogy, and feel free to tell me it's dumb. It's like in a house, like the post request is like your garbage and your toilets, and like your public anybody can come in there, like just send you a payloads. You know what I'm saying? And yeah,
But here we go. Yeah.
that's a good one, man.
No, I love what you're saying though. Is that things like just request method, it starts to paint a picture, tell a story about your application, how it's being used, how it's being attacked, where it might be vulnerable. It gives you a good perspective here, and it leads right into the kind of MIME type as well. One thing I thought was interesting, I'd love to get your guys' thoughts on this, is what we saw this go around is it's a large amount, 76% of those blocks, maybe really again this WAF activity was application JSON MIME type. So a lot of prevention around the JSON request type. And what does that tell us about, I don't know, the internet as a whole, how applications are being developed and architected?
Yeah, I mean, like, I'll start with that. Like and it basically tells you where your junks come from, right? In a sense, like JSON, it makes sense because like most of the API endpoint, are like RESTful, or even not even RESTful, like GraphQL, you name it, right? Contains like JSON payloads, right? So this is this is par for the course, in my opinion. It shouldn't be anything that's surprising for a lot of organizations, right? Obviously, you also see like payloads coming from like text, HTML, content type. You see a bunch like from XML, right? So you definitely want one thing when it comes to like designing your security mechanisms, right? You don't want to just look at JSON, but you also want to, because like I've seen like certain security products, they can only parse say XML. They have no ability to parse JSON. It's like, well, if you can't parse JSON, you can't look at the payloads. So you want to make sure you have the ability to parse HTML, parse JSON. You got to make sure your parser is up to speed. Guess what? Because most of the bypass to a WAF is to like exploiting their parser. So they're sending a payloads either through a special encoding format, or like they would send it in a format like even just sometimes just change. This is a JSON, but you change the format into like multi-part, whatever, and the WAP stopped parsing it because it just look at headers. Oh, this is not JSON, so I'm not parsing it. So then this is how you get the payload to slide through. So it's something to it's definitely something that you want to be able to like make notes of. Like while JSON it's the most popular, you also want to look at like what are some of the more obscure ones. There was an items on there that I want to point out, but I'll save it for later.
I think Richard made a great point. Is just an XML parser doesn't cover it in the modern age of web development. I don't find it surprising that the JSON application JSON and JSON payloads will represent such a large percentage, because in modern web development, JSON's eating the world. And it's not even just web development. You look at okay, for example, someone should cloud. Whether you're talking like CloudFormation and AWS and others, let me use, because AWS is the big one out there. It wasn't that long ago, 4 or 5, maybe a little bit more years ago, I don't remember the exact date, but CloudFormation was entirely XML and then moved to JSON based, and that totally took over. So it's web development, it's infrastructure. JSON, you've got to be able to parse in JSON as well as XML. But Richard's point as well is even the more esoteric and outlier is you've got to be able to parse all the data.
Yeah, speaking of outliers, when I look at the data, right, I always look at the smaller data points. Like the 1%er, the 0.5%ers. Like something that stood out right from the report is that we have 0.14, so 0.14% of like trace amount of other non-uncategorized information, right? But it might sound strange, but when you're talking about like billions and billions of data points a month, I mean 0.14% of a billion, it's quite a lot. And some of those content type turns out to be like images, JavaScript. I mean, it's like other like you would historically you think that, oh, those are static content, like those are highly cacheable. Why would you put WAV in front of your JPEGs? Like why you have a lot of images, right? What do you do that? Well, let me tell you that, right? There's this thing called lateral movement in security, right? It's like if those JPEGs, like unless you're putting them in the storage, like on the edge, right, net storage, and we're just 100% so if any of those requests goes back to your web tiers, like in your environments, if even just 0.1% of those requests goes back to your regions, it means that the attacker can actually ship payload either in the form of headers, cookie, query strings, arguments, etc., from the request to a JPEG file and send those things to your backend. So if you're using the same backend for your say your HTML and your JPEG like JPEG, right? You might be susceptible to lateral movements because they're saying, hey, like this is just image domain. Like maybe you don't need to protect that. A lot of people are like, why would I put it WAV? Waste my money, like to put the protections on a mostly static thing. And again, like this is something to notice. You always want to find flaws because as a defender, as somebody who as a blue team, right, you have to be right all the time. But the attacker just needs to be right one time, right? Who knows? Like the very first payloads in the very first JSON request that happens to get forwarded to the origins created a backdoor. It could happen.
Yeah, 100%. And what I love about kind of where you're going with this too is it spoke first about like painting a picture or telling a story about your application. So getting a good understanding of the architecture of your app, and then where are you applying your controls? Because to your point, where you think is maybe the least vulnerable might be that avenue of approach. When we're looking at, and again, this is inside the report as well, but when we're looking at the categories of attacks mitigated, 45% were actually access control rules, meaning prevention of maybe post requests if your app doesn't accept posts. Like limit your threat landscape, limit where attackers can poke and prod at your application by applying access control rules. If you don't accept application JSON, block it, right? Prevent it. There's no reason to even allow that to happen in the first place. And I think you bring a good point of like looking at the kind of the outliers, the smaller portions of the app. I love that thought process.
Very
there.
much.
So along those lines, like continuing to pull on that thread a little bit. So 45% are access control rules where we blocked. 37% were managed rules. So that's all of your threat intelligence and your cross-site scripting, those sorts of attacks. And then 19% were custom rules. Seeing this and thinking about like layered defense, that's kind of what I thought here was that as requests come in, they're going through these filters that you need to be kind of contemplating, right? When you deploy a WAF or your security controls within your application, you need to understand its architecture and adjust your security tools to match that to again limit your threat landscape. But then you also need layers, right?
You need layers, and one of the things I do want to, and I want to talk to layers, but I think this is what we're talking about here is just really shines a light on the importance of the feedback loop between your development, your feature developers, your basically your SDLC, your architects, and your security team. Because if your security team or your WAF or your SOC or whatever is flying blind, they don't know, okay, should we accept JSON payloads here? Do we not post? What do we do? Is that communication, that feedback loop, you can save money as far as FTE wasted time, save money on tooling, just a tight feedback loop between your developers, your architects, and your security team makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah. Like when it comes to like the layers, I always say Now I'm gonna bring up another buzzword, like defense in depth. Like I really think that we gotta have a mentality that it's just kind of like everybody has water filters. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is a single layers water filters. They're using fancy like coconut carbons, whatever, like you name it, right? But usually in general, when we look at securities, right? No single layers can be assumed to be a magic bullet. Like for example, just because you have bot management doesn't mean that you want to expect bot management to catch everything from application, like DDoS to like account takeovers. Every mechanisms work together. And the way you're trying to put it like as like efficient as possible. Like so like we're taking like 45% excess rules. I like to call it ACL. I mean it's ACL, right? It's that ACL usually runs on our first layer. And there's a reason behind that because it's cheap to run. It's just a bunch of like IPs, country, whatever, ASN, JA3 signatures, right? You run them behind because it's a static signatures that anything that violates those immediately gets filtered away in like we're saying sub milliseconds. Right? It's our whole layers plural runs in sub milliseconds, but like you want to be able to get rid of as much of its junk, right? And I used to have a buddy working in the industries. Like he would tell me, right, this is kind of what we call a shrinking the haystack. You want to take a whole bunch of like requests coming in, right, and you try to find the attack. It's kind of like you're trying to find that single HTTP request that's carrying that bad payloads and that result in a breach. So you're looking for a needle haystack. So be able to quickly shrink the haystack, remove as much of those junk as possible from front layers, so that the more sophisticated layers can process like additional data, would be very helpful. Again, it goes back to the fact that we're not just running a perimeter defense, right? It's just because you breach the wall doesn't mean you still have watchtowers, right? In fact, the whole concept of defense in depth is a military strategy that come from Roman as they expanded their territories to the point it becomes an empire. It's not feasible to just build walls around and just make sure that you only rely on the outer perimeters to like defeat the attack. This is why we have layered defense.
Absolutely. Yes. And I think we might have mentioned this or covered this in a previous discussion, Richard. I liked the immunology example here. Is if your health is dependent on a sterile environment, you're a dead man. It's not about avoiding. It's not about having a lockdown, walled up environment and everything within it sterile. It's about building immunity. And the only way you get that's how you are free from pathogens, is you develop immunity to them. And a layered approach is required for that. It's like yes, you need the best network firewalls. You do need a strong perimeter, but guess what? That's going to be breached. I mean, in the world of state actors and where the whole world is potentially a threat, effectively, you need to just plan that your perimeter is going to be breached. So once they do that, then what is the next layer, and the next layer after that, and the next layer after that, and then how are you monitoring that and fingerprinting those type of breaches so that you know what they're going after. It is imperative.
Yeah, it's interesting. And for some reason, I was thinking about how does like a distributed architecture play into that? Because I can see kind of two ends of the spectrum here. You might look at it and look at risk. You're adding sprawl, but then you also might look at it and bringing more value, distributing the workloads across various regions or locations, allowing for more availability. So where do you guys see that playing?
Absolutely. We live in the world of distributed architecture. When you have a global footprint, 300 plus points of presence around the world, we are in a massively distributed parallel compute age. And it is not just us. I mean, this goes back well over 20 years, but this is the essence of web development, web infrastructure. You have to assume you are distributed, that you're running massively in parallel. And where the thing that moves the needle here from a security, from a support, and from a cost standpoint is the first thing I would call out is avoidance of snowflakes. And this also relates to compliance. which we'll get to here in a bit, is that if you are running massively parallel, massively distributed, you need your infrastructure to be as similar as possible with as many variances in that distributed architecture. One, because when you're talking to your auditors, you can assert, you can attest, yeah, we just have to really look into one of those because this is a cookie cutter in every, we have to look at, and your auditors will sample it. They're not just going to take one example and run with that, but you can take, look at it, any of our global points of presence, and they are basically exactly the same, cookie cutter, one after another. That helps for security. So you have basically the same model that you're going after as you're working on your layers and rolling out your layers one, but also as you're tracking, scanning, and observing. That would be one of the big things I would talk about as far as distributed architecture. And the reason I was mentioning that with compliance is because if you're in a massively distributed system, your auditors are not going to want to pen test and audit every single one if they can validate and verify, and you can assert that they are the exact same architecture. They are cookie cutters of each other.
That makes sense? I feel like that's got to be easier said than done, right? Especially in given about like a distributed architecture in our scenario, right? We're not talking about deploying a whole bunch of EC2 instances that are coming from a gold image sitting someplace. We're talking about like hardware, right? In a sense, and being like, how do you operationalize something like that?
That is an excellent point. And where that comes to one, it's multi-layered approach to that as well, not just security. In that one that comes from your procurement and your lifecycle management team. You need to be aligned on that, because a good example, the reason, Kubernetes is a great example. It's parallel distributed, not globally distributed, but you're not going to be running a Kubernetes cluster all around the globe. But Kubernetes gets a great example of this, is that you run into problems in Kubernetes if you have a whole bunch of servers that have different drivers or different, different NIC cards or different hardware. You basically can't run Kubernetes. This is why, like I said, working with your lifecycle management and your procurement team to commoditize your infrastructure. That is the tip of the spear on that. You want to get your hardware as similar as possible to each other. Now, let me call out a great risk that we've recently experienced on that during COVID is the issue we found with logistics and the massive shock to the global distribution space has made it to where even if you were running commoditized cookie cutter hardware prior to COVID, with the delays in shipping, with the shocks to the shipping and transportation and the logistics of being even able to get the same type of chipsets or anything else like that. And it's not just you; it's the people that you buy hardware from, their suppliers, etc. It's throwing a big curveball on that. So that brings up the second layer where you have to adapt, and that is on when you get to imaging and the actual software you're running on it. First of all, like your hypervisor or your operating system or your hypervisor, that is the next layer, to where even if it is not completely uniform underneath, though you want to get there as close as possible, the next layer is to make it as much cookie cutter and uniform in your imaging and in your OS hypervisor layer. And then from there, similar approach with applications. You want to get this as standardized as possible for security, for cost, for a whole bunch of reasons.
I'll tell you, like, when it comes to applications, right, distributed, like, I know it's probably contrary to popular belief, and this might be a bit counterintuitive, because we're thinking about, well, distributed architecture, so we're taking from like a centralized servers or cloud environments, and we're distributed all over the world. What if I tell you that having a distributed architecture actually makes your attack surface smaller? It sounds kind of weird. It sounds kind of, but think of it this way, right? By having a distributed, and this is why I think it's very important when you're designing applications, especially if we're talking about website, right? you don't design. And what I find a common mistake, and this is borderline security, so if I veer off topic a little bit, is that I find there's a mistake where I've seen people, customers, organization, they will design the applications based on a centralized architectures, and they're trying to run it in a distributed platform like a, CDN. And then you have to create a lot of optimization. You have to like, oh, what needs to be shipped, after the fact to the logics. But the modern, it's called a modern design, right? It is to actually design the applications with a distributed architectures in mind. It'd be like, so for example, you're used to processing a lot of logics in the centralized locations, and you just use CDN to like cache your JPEG and your static files and etc. But how about you ship some of the logics? Like let's say you just take a really simple examples like your redirections, right? Yeah, you just like your origin, your centralized infrastructure is going to do redirections for a customer. What if you have like a tens of thousands of redirections linked, right? How about you ship those logics to the edge? How about you ship those things? And by doing that, right? When I say attack surface, right? You are by shifting those logic to the edge, right? You're reducing the loads. You're reducing the probability of failure in a centralized like architectures by having offload some of that. Outdoor security is what CIA, right? We're talking about the availability part of that is very important. So I would say like by moving a lot of those, including security mechanisms. So let's like if you are able to filter again, shrink the haystacks of the attack at the outer edge of perimeters, right? You are susceptible to less vulnerability in your centralized, a cloud or like hardware. Hopefully not anymore, you guys. 2024, but hardware. But basically, we call it the origins infrastructure, and that's very important. I can just tell that, like there's so many more things you can do because we are obviously as Edgio, we're implementing a lot of technologies, and I'll tell you, man, like just doing distributed countings in like 1 milliseconds and having all of the servers like synced across right the data, it's a pain when you're trying to sync the number of requests count per seconds across all of your infrastructures within a pub, right? But I think it's something that you want to make use of. So instead of having just a central brain like logics in your centralized architecture, started maybe split it up just like humans. Humans brains are technically distributed architectures. You have your cerebrum and you have your lizard brain. And guess what? Because when you touch something hot, you're not going to have time to react. If those things has to go through a central brain, you're going to burn yourself before you pull back, right? That's why. So like start thinking about what is the new architecture design. Maybe instead of doing machine learning and training and everything in centralized, you do inferencing on the edge, and then you do a training in centralized locations. Again, it goes back to like, in a sense, you're actually reducing the vulnerability a little bit and make your entire system more robust from a security perspective.
Yeah.
This dovetails perfectly what we were just talking about layering, is because in moving away from a centralized or what we were talking about with immunology as well, moving away from a centralized approach, if when you do get attacked and you do get pawned, the amount of data or the exposure that you have is tremendously limited. So it's not a full Boolean. Am I protected or am I not? When everything is centralized, all right, if they're in and they have access to the data, they're going to have access to the data. You make it distributed. Okay, maybe one region or one subset or one subsystem, an attacker can leverage a 0-day or whatever it is and get in, but they don't have your whole system. And it's also a resiliency thing because you are not losing your whole cerebral cortex all in one fell swoop.
By the way, like Lindsay Bot just fact checked me, and yeah, like I guess I use a bad analogy. Human is I guess we don't have brains in elsewhere, but I should have said is octopus. Octopus has like brains in all of their arms. Yeah, that is a true distributed architecture.
Yeah, that's fair. That's good. So staying along the lines of distributed architecture, maybe pulling in compliance a little bit here. One of the stats that I thought was pretty interesting to me, at least to see on paper. I was looking at like geolocation. So where are we blocking attacks from? The top 5 countries, all right, get this, top 5 countries were US, France, Germany, Russia, and Chechnya. What I thought was super interesting here, just for what it's worth, knowing that there's a lot of APTs that run out of China, they're not on the list. They're not on the list, which I thought was kind of interesting when we think about like geolocation. I think a lot of people turn to geofencing. Right? Hey, let me lock down in countries that I know are likely to be attacked from. But 26%, the number one hitter there was from the US. Like, what does that tell you guys? And also thinking about this from a compliance standpoint as well. What is geofencing like in 2023, 2024? That's where we're at now.
I mean, my opinion, right? I know we have like every customers, when we get on board, we have to talk about export control, and we have to like do like those control with like geofencing. I feel like some of those things, some of those requirements needs to get revisited. Since I know it might be not something that everybody wants to hear, especially if you run GRC. I apologize in advance if I'm giving you a headache. But I think we're in a day and age where it's like everybody gets their hands on VPN and everything, right? And so easy to just spin up VM everywhere. Like I remember when we were looking at, we gave a talk at Black Hat last year. We were looking at the distributions of like the ISP for anonymous Sudan DDoS attack, right? There's like they're using a hosting provider everywhere. We know where they come from. Like they come from this specific country in Eastern Europe. Like that's where the organization is, right? But then the attack comes from anywhere. Like nowadays, so it's like, do you then block Chinese hacker by geofencing China? Does that even work nowadays, right?
No, but you're absolutely right, and China is well known historically for using that very approach, VPNs, and really obfuscating the origin of where the attack is. Obviously, with Russia, there is so much of a homegrown, the state almost encouraging individual actors in Russia to take part of it. China's command and control structure is quite a bit less, shall we say, mob or oriented that you see in like Russia or Chechnya and things like that.
We're decentralized.
Exactly. Exactly. Good call. But yeah, and Richard, I absolutely think you're right. We do need to revisit this, but there are going to be customers and there are going to be market segments and verticals that do have regulatory requirements. So, and one of the big ones you don't mess with is Office of Foreign Asset Control, OFAC. And that's where geofencing and with like, especially anyone in the financial services, banking industry, making sure your banking or your financial services aren't available to North Korea, for example, or Iran and other places on the lists, on the OFAC list. Geofencing still matters, especially towards regulatory requirements. Are you right that we need to revisit those and we need in fact this just recently came up with in Ukraine where it was called out that the Russian while Starlink uses geolocation to keep it from being used in Russia, Russian soldiers and operators are utilizing it sourced from other countries in occupied Ukrainian territory. So I mean, and the list is long about dual use chips, dual use materials, things like that that could be used for both civilian and military purposes, and how that is oftentimes sourced from third party countries. And it's the same thing's true here. But there are still absolutely hard regulatory lines some customers have to deal with where geofencing very much comes into play.
Yeah, you're right. It's it's just an arms race. I think the point is like while we're talking about distributed architecture, we talk about how it's important for our customers to use that to protect us. But like Mike, like you said, well, the attackers are using distributed architectures. I mean, they are. Well, I mean, well, I guess it's kind of funny. I mean, that was the whole point of DDoS, right? I mean, that's where the D comes from.
Yep. Yep.
This is good. This is good. I'm disappointed that we're running into time because I think we can spend probably at least another 20 minutes on this topic alone. But since we are running out of time, I would love to hear just kind of thinking about this report, thinking about some of the data points that we talked about here, from application architecture to compliance, geofencing, the whole gamut. I love to hear your thoughts, recommendations to the audience. Like what should we be looking at? How can they better protect themselves? You can give like a minute or two on that. Richard, go for it. Oh, well, you're motivated. You look motivated. Let's go.
Yeah, no, I love this report. I want to bring it back and talking about the report. We can talk about distributed. We can talk about a lot of things, but one of the things that, and maybe this is because I'm going through a PCI audit right now, is one of the things I love about this report is in two things that just come to mind around where this report and these approaches help with your security and especially really your compliance stature. Is in PCI 6.1. It's one of the requirements in PCI is establish a process to identify security vulnerabilities using reputable outside sources for information and assign a risk ranking. Now, this report doesn't give exactly CVEs, but this is part, again, to layering. Your auditing approach is I love taking a report like this with specifics from maybe operating system vulnerabilities or shift left, like vulnerability database and that background, and being able to put together a whole picture for our auditors on the one hand. And then another requirement PCI is making sure that and I'm just focused on PCI, we can talk ISO, SOC 2, a whole bunch of other regimes. But the other thing is it's important to have your employees trained and up to date on the security landscape and how to prevent that. And yes, you do training on an annual basis. You need to do training when someone's hired every year after that. But reports like this is absolutely something I would give to every one of my employees and across the whole company just to increase security awareness. Helps with your compliance, helps with your security. I'm a big fan. So
that's great advice. I love that. How about you, Richard?
I'd say definitely like like sometimes having the visibility is very important, and I would say like to make things easier, right? It'd be nice to kind of like have this kind of visibility across all of the applications, at least while we're talking about public facing applications, because like I mean like we're not going to look at all of your like endpoints under management, like your laptops and Macs, but at least we can see like what's going out in and out, because I'm a firm believer that you need to have a one single pane of view for basically everything like internet facing that's coming in and out of here. Like we're talking about every HTTP request, every like just external request, right? To like in and out of the network needs to be cataloged and be great like if they are all collected and be able to reported under a consolidated view, like what we talk about here. I think it's gonna also help facilitate the compliance, especially when it comes to like providing evidence, etc. So again, visibility is important, right? If you look at the 5 phase of like a NIST security framework, right? I mean, there is on the far left side, there's a detection, like preventions, and then you have the response, right? But having the ability to have visibility, the detections is very important. You can't mitigate what you can see.
Yeah. I always equate security posture, visibility, exposures, and threats. I can't protect what I can't see. I need to understand where my weaknesses are, and I need to understand how I'm being attacked. It's the three of those that really come together to define your security posture. And Mike, I love what you're saying too about like sharing this with other people within the business. One of the deep dives that we do in the report as well as digging into directory traversal. That was actually pretty much the number one type of attack that we see still very prominent on the internet today. Now we're protecting against it, but it doesn't mean that applications aren't vulnerable to it. And ensuring that your engineers, your developers understand how this attack can be used against you is a great way to make sure that you're building secure code from the ground up. And what I love what we talked about today is thinking about the application architecture, not just your application architecture, but also your business and how it operates. So in using that to inform your security tools, right? So you have your application architecture, what types of requests do I expect to see, what types of MIME types, but also where is my business able to operate out of? And applying those and putting those all as part of controls into your security tooling. So I think that's what excites me about the report is not just looking at the data, but also taking the time to think about like, how can I use this information to think about the world just a little bit differently, and maybe use that to inform my security tools to put more controls, constraints to prevent my business from being popped. And at the end of the day, that's what we're here to do, is to protect the business, allow it to give it the freedom of maneuver to, make money for our constituents, and bring value to our customers. So good stuff. So that's all we have for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining in on ThreatTank. If you want to stay up to date with the latest threat intelligence from Edgio, jump over to edge.io. That's edg.io, and subscribe. You'll get more intel as it comes out. Michael, Richard, loved the conversation. I feel like, again, we could have gone at least another 45 minutes. This was great. I really appreciate both of your time.
Yeah. Thanks for having us here. Thanks for the great engagement and discussions.
Thanks for the great information, Tom. Yeah, appreciate it, and always fun chatting with you, Richard.
Outstanding.
Likewise, man. See you guys.
Till next time.